Chapter 21, A War Apart. 2 weeks later.
Ambassador,
Nell said with the utmost enthusiasm,
I am very happy we were able to come to an agreement.
The Green Earth ambassador sitting across from Nell dipped his head just so. He was a handsome man. Severe, perhaps, but handsome. Far too serious for Nell's tastes, though.
Likewise, Commander.
Then he turned to the man sitting next to Nell.
And you, Mr. Secretary? Absolutely. This is a great day.
The red-haired woman accompanying the ambassador extended her hand.
I'm so glad this is done with,
Jess said.
Maybe we can finally have some peace.
Nell gladly shook the offered gesture, beaming.
I hope so, General. I hope so.
Jess smiled back. She looked smart in her green uniform, buckled belt and tie. Very prim and proper. Or as proper as a tank commander could be. The handshakes went around. Then the Green Earth side of the table, Jess, the ambassador, and 2 aides, gathered their things, pushed in their chairs, and rounded the table. Jess gave Nell a salute as she was leaving, and Nell returned it. Orange Star's Secretary of Foreign Affairs followed them to shut the mahogany door after their departure. Then he turned back to the mahogany room. It was quite mahogany, actually. The table, chairs, even the lamps, they were all of the same reddish-brown hue with only slight variations. The secretary, a fat man with bristling grey mustaches and quite the ambassador's opposite, rubbed his hands together. An uneducated person might have summoned a stereotype and labeled him as a dishonest politician, but Nell knew he was about the most honest upper-level government official in Orange Star.
Well, he said, I'm very glad that's up and done with. Echoing the good general's words, I dearly hope we see more than a few months of peace in our time.
Nell adjusted her violet cap, and then picked up her briefcase. Inside she breathed a heavy sigh of relief. It was done. The conflict was officially over, and would be forever remembered in the annals of history as the Resting War. Not because of any general lack of bloodshed, no, but because the war began and ended on a Sunday. Fighting was officially 2 weeks over. The casualties were still being counted. Given the 2 theaters in Omega Land and Cosmo Land, it was being estimated at 1,500 per side. Perhaps not many compared to the Black Hole conflicts, but for such a short space of time, very bloody. And very sudden. The suddenness had contributed to deaths on both sides. It was all unfortunate. More than unfortunate.
It's not quite over, Mr. Secretary, she reminded him.
The man nodded while gathering his own briefcase and a rather fancy pen that he dropped in his suit's breast pocket.
Ah, true enough, Commander. But I don't suspect we'll have any real trouble with Yellow Comet, eh?
He chuckled, but it quickly faded.
I forget myself. That is not an issue to be taken lightly.
He turned one old, wizened eye to Nell.
Tell me, Commander, what is your position on the issue of the comets? I could always use friendly advice.
Nell set her hands on the back of a chair and drummed her fingers. Orange Star was still technically at war with the Empire. That country had relinquished control of Dorton City and withdrawn, but only because their forces were spread too thin to retain it and defend their Omega Land holdings at the same time. But the Comet Nation was becoming increasingly polarized between hardliners and loyalists. The former still grudgingly declared their fight in Orange Star and the latter desired a peaceful settlement. The loyalists, of course, found their leadership in Sonia. The analysts were expecting civil war.
I will be frank, Mr. Secretary. If we are going to play mediator, then you only have one shot. The fighting will start soon, I imagine.
The secretary's mustaches wiggled as he pondered this.
Yes. Well. I'll do my damnedest, if you will excuse my language.
He shook his head.
Still, as I said, more than just a few months of peace would be excellent.
Nell adjusted her briefcase shoulder strap.
We shall see, Mr. Secretary. We shall see. He was a soldier, like any of us,
Sammy began.
Just another soul brought into a war that no one wanted to fight. But when he was called upon, he did not hesitate. He did not shirk from his duties. He stood by each and every member of the armed forces that is standing here today.
Sammy cleared her throat. Then, for just a fraction of a second, she stopped. It wasn't a lengthy speech. Besides, she hadn't known Christophe for very long. But during that short time she had gotten to know him quite well. It was hot, for an early September Saturday. Not humid, just hot. Sammy was in full uniform, and it wasn't terribly comfortable. But no one would ever catch her complaining. Not even about her shoulder, which still hurt. The dais stood in front of her, on the tiny erected podium that supported her polished shoes. Her short, typed work sat upon the dais surface. Down to the podium's front was the coffin itself, wrapped in the orange and gold flag of the nation, resting on the green grass. It was flanked by 2 rows of honor guard, each man standing perfectly still, rifles parallel. There was not a blemish on their black caps, nor on their black uniforms. Max stood among them as the ranking officer, dwarfing each man. He, too, looked out of place in his uniform, his hat alone big enough for a horse. Beyond them were the relatives and friends. An elderly couple, perhaps in their mid-60s, assumedly the parents. One Sepp Lee, one Romana Dubois. A few others, close friends from outside the military. And Sammy, up front. All of it was taking place under the shadow of a rather large oak. After that fraction of a second, Sammy swallowed, and continued.
I worked with Captain Christophe John. He took orders, and he gave them, and never was either task done poorly by him. It was his command of Kilo Company that won the Battle of Lock Haven. It was his command, and his decision to put himself in the line of fire at Kalsiki, that allowed our armed forces to liberate that city. I am afraid I cannot repeat all the high words Captain Lee had to say about his good friend, for I did not know Captain Jorn as long as he. But I will say that I was proud to serve alongside him, as I am proud to serve alongside those who remain with us.
The flag was presented to Christophe's parents. Sammy watched from a short distance as it happened. Sepp Lee and Romana Dubois folded the flag in precise measurements. 13 folds total. Then Lee took the flag and turned to the older couple to hand it to them. They didn't cry. But their expressions were somber. Perhaps they had prepared for the possibility that their son would die in this war-torn world, as was wont to happen to soldiers. Captain Lee stepped back and saluted. Max gave a command to the honor guard. Sammy didn't hear what it was. They all turned in tandem, clicked heels, and marched away from the small podium. And that was it. With the ceremony done, Lee abandoned the precise motions required by military funeral rites. But he remained respectful. He knelt next to the parents and removed his cap to give them what appeared to be consoling words. There was familiarity there. Sammy didn't know if Lee knew them well or not. After some time he stood, replaced his cap, and saluted again. He faced Dubois and nodded. Then his eyes found Sammy, and he made a beeline for her.
Lieutenant Colonel,
he said as he approached, saluting. She returned the salute. Even if it was done with her right hand, her left shoulder ached with the movement. The sling had been removed only yesterday.
Captain.
She had only met Sepp Lee the day following the Battle of Kalsiki, but she felt like she had known him for a lot longer. Maybe because of his relationship to Christophe.
How are your new stripes?
Sepp's curly hair was getting to be past regulation length, and spilled from under his cap. He lifted his right arm and looked at his insignia patch on his shoulder.
Fine, I suppose. I don't really care either way. You'll come around, trust me. You deserved the promotion. I heard what you did for Kilo Company in Kalsiki. That took guts.
They stood there in silence for a moment. Sepp lowered his arm and looked up at the sky, like he was wondering at the heat. Sammy looked with him. It was otherwise a perfect day. Blue sky, white clouds. Everything was green and blue and white. It was something peaceful to admire, finally, after all the fighting. Sepp's gaze dropped. He looked down at the ground, scratched his cheek. Then he swept his cap off and ran a hand through his hair.
I lost 2 good friends in that stupid war, Colonel. My captain and a fellow lieutenant. I'm not in a good mood, no.
Then he looked back at Sammy.
I also heard things, Colonel.
Sammy had been watching the oak tree, examining its crags and patterns from afar. Now her eyes settled on Lee again.
Things. About Kristoff. Mostly from his loaders, from Lockhaven and Kalsiki. Like something wasn't quite right about him, ma'am. There were other things.
His pupils were a funny shade of grey. Sammy noticed this as they fixed on her.
You were there, Colonel. What happened to him?
Sammy blew out a breath. She rubbed the bridge of her nose with a thumb and index finger. What was she going to tell him? The truth? Or some lie to make Kristoff seem better than he was? They had already done that with the ceremony. It was obligatory to pick out only the best qualities of the deceased. And none of what Sammy had said was a lie. The unseemly parts had just been left out. A deep part of her reflected on what had happened to Kristoff. She wondered what had ultimately caused his breakdown, caused him to believe those things he said about Eagle. Lockhaven? Certainly the events there were a trigger. Seeing those civilians killed, seeing such destruction. Those were not events to be taken lightly. By anyone. Or had it been earlier? He had held such hatred for Black Hole. Utter, complete hatred. Sure, the Allied nations had fought tooth and nail against Sturm and von Bolt for years, but Sammy didn't remember the hatred being so strong. The fact that Kristoff had been forced to work with Black Hole must be interacted poorly with his psyche. She had seen enough evidence to believe so. There is no justice. Save what we create. His words defined him.
Yes,
she said finally, looking off at nothing.
Yes, I was there. I was with him, from the very beginning. But I'll tell you, Captain, even though we went through the same experiences, saw the same things, Kristoff wasn't. He wasn't fighting for the same reasons I was. We were a war apart from one another.
Sepp watched her for the longest time. He blinked. Sammy would have put her hands in her pockets, if she had them.
I'm sorry, Captain. I don't know what else to tell you.
Sepp ran his tongue through his gums. His Adam's apple shifted as he swallowed. Then, slowly, he replaced his cap, and assumed a standing military posture.
Thank you, Colonel. I understand.
He clicked his heels and saluted. Sammy returned it. Then Sepp Lee pivoted and walked away. End of chapter. Chapter 22, The Beginning. It was good whiskey. Strong. Just the way Siegfried would have liked it. But it was also sipping whiskey, so Sepp sipped. He might have been a smoker, but he wasn't a heavy drinker. The Withersburg bar named King's was about as standard as they came. Sepp sat on a wooden stool, hunched over the wooden counter, looking at nothing but the wooden shelves with their many varieties of alcohol. Any bystander might have said he was a drunkard, or a man trying to wash away his sorrows with liquor, which were often one and the same. But in reality, Sepp was just enjoying the whiskey, and not physically showing it. He picked his elbows off the countertop and stuck his hands in a jacket pocket. He felt a box of cigarettes and a lighter. He picked the lighter, but left the box. Then he fished around in the other pocket, producing a fat cigar. Just the kind Siegfried would have liked. It was Sepp's tribute to the fallen second lieutenant. Though he was a smoker, he didn't often have cigars. Today, however, was certainly an exception. As he flicked the lighter on and touched the merry flame to the cigar's end, the bar door opened, letting in the light of the day. A figure stepped in, someone in a grey jacket. The evenings were getting cooler, apparently. The figure stood at the doorway for a moment. Then it walked towards the counter and stopped next to Sepp.
Coffee, please. Black, no cream, no sugar.
Sepp looked up at the newcomer.
Lo, Roma.
Roma settled into the stool next to Sepp's. Her hair was still bundled in a knot, and other than her street clothes she still exuded that aura of military properness.
Hello, Sepp.
Sepp puffed his cigar. The taste was interesting. Wasn't his favorite, but it would do. For Siegfried.
Did you come searching for me, or do you just have bad luck?
Roma set her forearms on the counter and smirked.
Both. How's the whiskey? Strong. Good. Just the way Siegfried would have liked it.
Yep, Sepp said. He plucked his cigar from his lips and took another sip of the stuff. The bartender set a steaming mug in front of Roma. She thanked him and cupped her hands around it.
Coffee, hey? Yep. Just the way Christoph would have liked it.
Roma laughed.
Christoph never liked coffee. He just drank it because it was there to drink. Besides, you have to have something to do on the front.
Sepp shrugged.
Whatever.
He took another drag on his cigar, and blew colored smoke.
It's the least we can do for him. Drink and smoke? That it is.
They sat there in silence for a while. The bar wasn't much full. A couple patrons were having a conversation in one of the corner booths, but it was still early. And it was a Tuesday. So if Sepp had decided to drink himself to death, the bartender probably wouldn't have cared. It would have brought some cash in on a slow day. But that wasn't why Sepp was there. No to lament. But to remember. And, perhaps, to celebrate.
So we're captains now, I guess,
he remarked. Roma blew out her cheeks. It was a strange response, coming from her. She was never one to shy away from a promotion.
Yes we are. Captain Lee. Has a ring, doesn't it? I dunno,
Sepp said.
I think Captain Dubois flows better off the tongue.
Roma laughed. Another unusual gesture from her. Sepp supposed she was starting to loosen up.
I hear,
Roma began,
that we'll be getting our own companies soon. Imagine that. Each of us, in charge of a whole company.
She glanced at her friend.
The word is that you'll be put in charge of Bravo.
Sepp snorted.
Bravo? Not much left of it.
He waved the cigar at nothing.
Some promotion. Yes, but the name remains. And there were survivors. You. Your gunner. A handful of others. And my artillerymen.
She had a point. Bravo wasn't completely gone. And even if it was, it could be rebuilt.
And you?
He asked.
Right now I'm being put in charge of the MPs helping rebuild Central Kalsiki. I ship off tomorrow. Ouch. Sorry about that. Don't be,
she said, taking a sip of her coffee.
It isn't fighting. I need a break from fighting. Creating something will be different. Refreshing, even.
Sepp took his whiskey glass in his hand and sloshed around the caramel liquor within.
And after that?
Roma shrugged.
We'll see. Bravo may need an artillery supplement. And they will need an officer.
She nodded, lips pursed in thought.
I could forward my resume.
Sepp glanced at her. Then back to his whiskey, and the glowing butt of his cigar.
That,
he said, a grin forming on his lips,
would be fine.
Apparently, the Army's protocol for treating a former prisoner of war, after ensuring everything about him or her was medically sound, was to give leave. It didn't make too much sense to Max. As a POW, he had been on a leave of sorts. The Green Fellows had fed him, kept him safe, let him take frequent strolls outside. Don't argue it, Max. Just smile and nod. He was smiling, sure. Why would anyone on a beach not be smiling? And he might as well help revive the Dorton City tourist industry. The comets might have been gone, but people were still trying to pick up their lives and, even for early September, the number of beachgoers was low. So Max had virtually a 50-foot radius of sand to himself. He was lying on a beach towel, arms behind his head, eyes half closed behind a pair of sunglasses. His shirt was off, but not because he wanted a tan. Just because, why not? He was on a beach, you didn't need a reason on a beach. In front of him the trapedial sea stretched away into blue nothingness, light waves flowing ever beachward. Geography told Max there was another shore, but you couldn't see it from here. He cracked his neck one way, removing his left hand and feeling in the sand to his side. His knuckles bumped into his cooler, fingers worked way up and found the lid. Then he flipped it off to dig around the ice inside and find a can of soda. Max sat up. He pulled the tab and took a sip. Refreshing. Bubbly. Sweet. Soda was one thing he didn't have as a POW, and he meant to make up for the lost time. Then, he paused and looked up at the sky again. His grin faded.
"To you, Christophe," he said, taking another gulp.
Wasn't champagne, but he knew Christophe wouldn't have cared. Now, though, wasn't the time to think about it. The funeral was done and past. Max would retain the captain in his memories, as was custom among military types. He took another sip, and then dug a small hole in the sand to keep the can upright. After that he reached down to his feet, which was a task, since his muscles didn't afford him flexibility, and snatched up his cell phone. A few buttons later and it was ringing at his ear. A click.
"Hello. Sammy."
Max boomed. A couple seagulls down the beach flew off.
"It's Max, how you doing?"
He heard a laugh from the other end of the line.
"Hey, Max. I'm fine. You enjoying your time off?" "Am I?"
he asked as though Sammy's question was ridiculous. Which it was.
"Sure as hell am. I'm in Dorton City, soaking up the rays. How's the weather there?"
Max looked up. The sky was cloudless, sun beating down at something in the high 90s.
"Perfect. I love it."
Max dug his feet into the sand, and his foot tapped a hard object. A shell. He plucked it from the granules and tossed it at the sea.
"Listen, Sammy, I've got a proposition for you."
A pause.
"I'm listening." "What say you, me and Andy get together sometime soon? Like, this week soon. You guys could come here, if you wanted, the weather's supposed to stay awesome. Or we could go somewhere else. Do anything. I dunno. Cosmo, macro, doesn't matter. It's been a while since we've all been best buds, like we were back in the day."
Sammy laughed, that good friend's laugh.
"Andy's still all the way back in Zerlin, you know. So? He can get here in a couple days. Or we could hop on a plane and go kidnap him from Nell. I'm sure he wouldn't mind."
Another laugh, and a sigh.
"That would be great, Max. Unfortunately I'm busy this week. Within the month, though, I agree. We should do something."
Max smirked. Wasn't this week, but he would take it.
All right. I understand. I have some personal leave stashed away, beyond what the army gave me, so any time works. Do you want to give Andy a ring, or should I? If you could, that would be great." "Okay, will do. But you give me a call when you've got an idea of when you're free, alright?" "Okay Max. I promise. I'll talk to you later." "Right. Peace."
Peace. Sammy closed her cell phone and slipped it into her pocket. The weather was nice, but considering she was on the other side of the continent from Max, her weather was probably different from his. It was closer to morning, too. Maybe in the low 60s. The sky was a sort of light blue, not the straight blue that most people thought of as a perfect day. But the color, Sammy was all right with it. It held its own beauty. Her brown boots scooted over the rough trail as she climbed a hill. Her green khakis were spotted with dirt, but she didn't care. Dirt never stopped her from taking a hike. She wore a windbreaker over her white top, headband under her hair. On her back was a small rucksack, straps around her shoulders. It all felt right. She stepped from the trail, clambered onto a boulder, stood up straight, and looked around. The dirt path wound along the edge of a forest and up a gentle slope. The trees were pines, the forest floor covered in layers of dead, brown needles from seasons before. She heard a bubbling stream somewhere nearby but hadn't spotted it yet. To the trail's left side, the open side, the hill was swathed in high grass that swayed in an unfelt breeze. Other than the trail itself, there were no signs of humanity. Sammy jumped down from her boulder and resumed her trudge up the path. As she walked, she worked her left arm. Her shoulder ached, but the aching was getting better every day. Of course, the scar just below her collarbone would be there for life, but that didn't matter. Birds chirped. The stream's bubbling receded behind her, and now the breeze took its place. There were no cars, no distant highways, no planes overhead, no trains chugging through the wilderness. There were no crowds, no stores, no houses, and no high-rises. Most importantly, there were no tanks and no guns. Sammy was miles out from the nearest village, having left in the early morning hours. And yet she didn't feel tired. Fruit and water, that was all she had packed to eat, and it was all she needed. There was no need to press for time. She had all the time in the world. No engagements, no issues. No need to worry about leave hours anymore. Before she had left Withersburg, and after Christoph's burial, Sammy had taken an afternoon to lock herself in an office with a laptop and a printer. Just a half a day, that was all she needed. She had typed up a letter. Short, to the point. A letter addressed directly to Commander-in-Chief Nell of the Orange Star Armed Forces, because she was the only one who would understand. Sammy had typed that letter of resignation from her position as Lieutenant Colonel of the OSA, and printed it. Just to see if she had it in her. Just to see if she could. Then she had torn it up. The hill's crest was up ahead. A part of her tried to calculate the distance, but she ignored it. There was no reason to. There were no measurements needed. The top of the hill was there, and that was all there was to it. Once she reached the hill's apex, Sammy stopped, arched her back, and tilted her head left and right. She looked over the scene before her. Now the hill rolled down, trail still winding. Way off in the distance, she could see the white-topped peaks of a mountain range. It looked half a world away. Then, Sammy slipped her hand into the pocket of her windbreaker. Her fingers returned around the small, folded paper Eagle had left in Kalsiki. The paper he had left under the hard drive and memory stick. The same objects she had destroyed after he left. Put a bullet in the drive and smashed the stick under her boot. She opened the paper. Written on it was a set of coordinates. She looked west, and smiled. On the hill's gradual downslope, there was a small cabin. Cabin wasn't really the right word, because it had relatively modern siding and framework. It had a brick chimney too. There was even a satellite dish fixed to the top. It was tiny, quaint, a secret from the world only known to a few people. 2 people, in fact. Tanner flicked his bathroom light on. A small room. Functional. It didn't need to be any larger. Tanner stepped to the sink and opened the mirror cabinet above. The shelves within held many medications and toiletries. He rummaged between them, pushed aside a box of allergy drugs and a bottle of hair dye, and found what he was looking for. Aspirin. He popped the cap open and shook 2 white tablets out. Then he replaced the aspirin and shut the cabinet. A face stared at him through the medium of the mirror. An expressionless face, a face that said nothing and betrayed less. A face with dark gray eyes and graying eyebrows, a face marked by age and experience. Tanner glanced down and picked up a small cup from the sink's rim. He filled it under the tap. Then he threw the pills into his mouth and drank. The cup was returned, and as Tanner left he flicked the light switch off. He passed through his cafe. The overhead lamps were on, by virtue of the fact that it was still early morning. Through the facade panes he saw the sun just creeping over the horizon, rising to spill its light on the buildings and residents of Lock Haven. Or, what was left of them. Tanner passed by the counter and picked up a coffee tin from its surface. Then he made for the door, the bell tinkling as he passed through. On the sidewalk outside, he had set up a white folding table. On it there were 3 pots of coffee, their cables running down one of the table's legs and plugged into an orange, multi-socket extension cord. The cord ran back through his cafe door. Also, on the table were stacks of styrofoam cups, as well as sugar and milk. Tanner had made sure he had milk this time. Despite the early morning hour, the people of Lock Haven were milling about, down the sidewalks, across the roads, in and out of buildings that had been deemed safe. They carried boxes and bags, or they were watching children, or they were performing repairs on the many destroyed residencies of the town. Directly across the street, a group of men was hauling a ruined sofa from an office building, while two more people passed pieces of wooden and concrete rubble through a window. The man receiving the pieces threw them into a pile of trash. Up road to the left, someone had volunteered the services of their truck and was organizing the towing of smashed and burned cars. A couple military types were among them, apparently trying to decide what to do about the rather out-of-place Oberon sitting shattered in the middle of the road. Tanner looked to the right. There was a mix of adults and children planting new trees and bushes on the wayside. There were also two people coming up the sidewalk. The first was a shorter man in a plaid shirt and jeans. He was accompanied by a woman wearing a worn t-shirt, its fabric spotted with various colors, rather like she had been painting. They chatted between themselves for a while, until they neared Tanner.
"I heard there was coffee,"
the man said as they approached. Tanner nodded.
"Yes. Please help yourself."
He gestured to the items at the table's end.
"There is milk and sugar there. I have 2 pots of regular and 1 of decaf." "I think I'll take regular. God knows we need the caffeine."
The man took the handle of the corresponding pot end, while his friend held 2 cups, poured a steaming hot batch into each. When they were full, the woman set them down and got 2 more.
"We've been sent on a coffee run," she explained. "Mr. Yulway's roof caved in, and his neighbors feel they need a little pick-me-up before they start hauling out the heavy bits."
Tanner dipped his head.
"I'm glad I can be of service. It's the least I can do for our community."
As the man finished with the next cups, he replaced the pot and picked up the original pair.
"Always been a fan of your coffee, Mr. Tanner. Nice little business you have."
He took a sip of one.
"Hard to believe you only moved here a month and a half ago. Your cafe feels as homey as any." "You are too kind. If you need anything else, just ask."
The woman smiled.
"Thank you. The same goes for you."
Then they turned away and resumed whatever conversation they had been engaged in before. Tanner watched them go. Supplying coffee truly was the least he could do. He supposed he was in good enough shape to help with the heavy lifting, and if someone asked he would comply, but right now he felt odd. At peace, perhaps. He had forgotten what peace was like, but maybe this was it. Peace for everyone. The war was over. He had read the casualty list online, those who were confirmed casualties, anyway. When he had seen Christoph Jorn's name, something changed within him. Perhaps it was sadness that he had felt. But later he had found a short article in Lock Haven's local newspaper concerning the captain, and Tanner's spirits had been lifted. Christoph Jorn was given credit for saving the town, and for guiding the main thrust of the assault that seized Kalsiki. It was because of his bravery and his quick-witted command that Orange Star was able to retake it. He hoped his talk with the officer had been beneficial. It was, after all, the least he could have done. Someone giggled to his left, breaking into his thoughts. A high-pitched giggle.
"Look at you. Being nice to people? When did that start?"
Tanner turned. Leaning against the wall was a small girl, her hair frizzy beyond what was considered normal. Black top, black pants, and a trench coat. She was quite out of place in the little town. And she was grinning. Tanner blinked. To be honest, he was surprised. But, like always, he didn't show it.
"Lash,"
he stated simply. "Duh." Lash ambled over, hands in the pockets of her coat, and stood next to him.
"It took me forever to find you. You're a hard man to track, you know."
Tanner looked up, over her head of hair.
"That was my intention." "Why?"
Lash turned and leaned against the table. Tanner might have been worried if she wasn't so light.
"I wanted to sever my connections with my old life."
His gaze swept the road.
"This is my home now. I have started anew.
Lash crossed her arms and pouted.
Phooey. That's no fun.
She looked over her shoulder and stuck her finger in the sugar pot, picking out a cube and popping it into her mouth.
Why would you want to do that?
Tanner looked down at her. Lash looked back, almost a true expression of innocence on her face. Almost.
It seemed. Right. Right, hey.
She procured another sugar cube.
I guess. Sure. If that's what floats your boat.
He frowned, setting his fingers on the tabletop.
I heard what you did, Lash. Do you not consider your actions to be right as well? What, you mean helping Orange Star?
She played with the cube between her lips.
Yes.
She shrugged.
I guess. Same could be said if I'd helped the Greenies. That would have been different. Green Earth attacked first.
Lash giggled.
So that makes them the bad guys? Boy, this new life has got your head all funny.
She flapped the overly long sleeves of her coat.
Me, I dunno. I might accept the Orange's deal to go work with their R&D. What do you think, Mr. Morals?
She asked, poking Tanner in the arm.
Is that right?
Tanner said nothing, and he looked away, out at nothing. Maybe he was looking between the buildings at the green beyond, but even he wasn't sure. Right? Wrong? He supposed in war, right and wrong did not factor into things. But he was not at war anymore. He had given up war, and was now at peace. With the world. With himself. That was right, he knew it was. Because it felt right, not because someone told him, or because some ancient philosopher said it 1,000 years ago. Because he knew, instinctively, that it was the case. So as the sun rose in the east, he watched its colors spill over the horizon and play with the world below. It was a new day, a new dawn, a new chance for everyone. It was warm. And, for the first time in many years, Hawk smiled. End of chapter. Chapter 23, Author's Notes and FAQ. Wow! Here we are, at the end of my tale. It's been quite a while since I began work on A War Apart. The first chapter was originally posted on December 27 of 2009, and now, 367 days later, I have finished the story. According to my processor, A War Apart clocks in at 134,311 words and 248 pages. I'm fine with calling it 134,000. This is, by a huge margin, the longest work I have ever finished, fiction and non-fiction included. When I began, I never imagined how huge this would grow. I would first like to thank those who read the story on fanfiction. Even if you haven't posted a review, or subscribed, or put me on author alert, I must thank you, though authors do love to hear comments. The fact that you've come this far means you have enjoyed what I present, and it is much appreciated. I also want to thank the forum members of Advance Wars Net and Wars Central who have given me support and expressed their interest. You guys are the best. Your continued remarks, praise, and your work to catch my typos and mistakes, you know who you are, and I really do appreciate it, has strengthened this work. And, finally, to my girlfriend, who didn't laugh and only supported me when I admitted I was writing fanfiction. I love you. What follows is a series of FAQ questions regarding the development of A War Apart and my own experiences as an author. Please note that these questions and answers contain spoilers, so if you have just clicked the last chapter for the sake of doing it, shame on you. Additionally, if anyone has further questions they wish to ask, feel free to drop me a message and, if appropriate, I'll update this section with answers at a later time. Regards. CE. Q. How did A War Apart originate? A. It began, strangely enough, with Chapter 4. The very first piece I wrote was the section where Kristoff and Sammy are bounding through the woods, fleeing Green Earth. It was supposed to be a one-shot, and I wasn't even sure if I was going to post it. That original version was about war, fear, and terror, and was written from the point of view of a soldier in the middle of it all. I had hardly defined Kristoff as a character at that point. He was just someone I had created to fill a gap. Later, I got to thinking. A crazy notion germinated that I liked to write. Sure, I'd written before, check my fiction press account, named below, but I felt like I could go somewhere with this new piece. And I loved Advance Wars. So it snowballed. Furthermore, I personally enjoy black and gray morality as a writing style, rather than black and white, so this gave me the opportunity to put a darker, more realistic tinge on the otherwise happy and cartoony wars world and its denizens. That was one of my major goals, by the way, to take Advance Wars and make it real. To make the interactions real, to make the events real, to make the characters real. I wanted to inject realism into everything about it. In fact, it was my most important goal. If I succeeded in doing that, then I believe I am a decent author, or at least one who can keep his shit together. Q. Where did Christoph, Sepp, and all your original characters come from? A. As mentioned, Christoph began with the one-chapter precursor to A War Apart. But that was Christoph the name, not Christoph the person. He developed as a character later, but before I actually got around to writing Chapter 1. He started simply as an officer who hated Black Hole, and through my words I let him grow from there. He became much more and much deeper, with strengths and flaws. I wanted to see him develop, and so he did. Sepp's likeness and personality, perhaps stretched a bit, is based on one of my good friends. Carefree, sarcastic, but a good man. Smart as hell. He has a duty, and he'll do it, but he won't necessarily enjoy it. As minor characters, Roma and Siegfried came about first as simple companions to Christoph. Actually Sepp began that way too, but around the time he got his own point of view was when I decided to flesh him out. Then they shifted to companions for Sepp. Christoph had Sammy, Jake, and Rachel to buddy with, so Roma and Siegfried gravitated towards Sepp Lee. In order to develop a character, one needs other characters to accompany them, and it was just convenient. But the Lieutenant trio worked very well, in my mind. There is another, darker reason for why I created the characters I did. To kill them. I knew from the very beginning that people were going to die. I knew from about Chapter 3 that Christoph was going to die. That was when I made the decision to have him descend into the broken, shattered, and ultimately remade man that he became. He was remade, yes, but into someone else, as Sammy remarked. Q. And the Advance Wars characters? How did you make your decisions to include them and narrate them? A. Sammy was a given. Everyone likes her. She's one of the few characters who actually experiences some development in the games, and is the only one who has a, heavily implied, romance with another character. I won't say she was easy to write, but I didn't have to shoehorn her emotional development and feelings, or the way she spoke and acted. The dynamic of her relationship to Eagle provided me with a lot to work with, so I took it and ran. I decided to offer Nell's point of view as a contrast to the grunts in the thick of the fighting. She's removed from the bloodshed and the conflict, but at the same time she is acutely aware of it all. She isn't a faceless politician, she's Nell. She also has a personality. She provides a view into the world of strategic command, which would have otherwise been hidden to the reader. The soldiers might experience the bulk of the conflict, but without a larger context the war would have quickly become superficial. Nell's role was to impress upon the reader that, yes, the events of the story were very real. Max was the most challenging. I devoted to him the fewest chapters and shortest sections. He only had one environment throughout 99% of the story, anyway. But he also contrasts with Sammy, Christoph, and Sepp as a man stuck in a position where he cannot fulfill his duties. He takes it well enough, but there's some frustration there. His role becomes one of communicating to the reader the nature of the enemy, and his eyes open up a keyhole view into Eagle's mind. Q. Are there themes in the story? A. Oh yeah, all over the place. They're not hidden. If you can't find them then you're looking too hard. Q. What were the biggest challenges in writing A War Apart? A. There were several. The first was keeping up the will to write. During the spring of 2010 I was studying abroad in Beijing. The minor culture shock I experienced and strange, new environment pretty much disconnected me from everything I had been doing in the States, except Civilization 4, I got really good at Civ 4 in China. There was so much to do and see, and the classes were so hard, that I really could not keep writing while I was there. I got maybe 4 pages done total. When I returned I found my spark again and continued, but then StarCraft 2 landed at the end of the summer, and I had been waiting for it for 12 years, so I couldn't exactly pass it up. After that, I went through the busiest school semester I had ever had. It's my senior year and there were a lot of things that had to be done. But during this past winter break I found time and resolved to complete the story. So I did. In terms of the actual writing, there were definitely obstacles to overcome. Keeping the narrative fresh when confined to certain environments, like a tank's cabin, was often difficult. If I write the word viewer or extension one more time I might cry. The point of view from such a narrow physical setting is limited. Tanks are not limber, and they are not interesting beyond the fact that they're 60-ton machines with a huge gun, which is cool in and of itself, but that's beside the point. The story has to come through the characters inside that tank. It has to come from what they do with it. Honestly, the battles were the hardest thing to write. You might think them easy, but no, when sitting behind the computer they can be boring. You have to pack as much detail and action into a single chapter or section, which can quickly become tedious. Character interactions were much more fun to imagine and set to words. Retaining military accuracy was something that required a bit of work too. I did layman's research, read Wikipedia and Google Images, to learn pretty much everything I know about armed forces worldwide. Everything else came from different pieces of fiction I have read, which will be listed below. I have the United States Army rank structure memorized because of the research I did for A War Apart. Of course, I took a few liberties here and there, so don't expect everything to be 100% accurate. Or even 70%. If you use this story as a bibliographic source in your next report, do not point fingers at me when you get an F. Finally, I stumbled across one last challenge when I was wrapping it all up. Death. It's harder to narrate than you think. Death is more than just killing a character and removing him from the story. You really have to show what impact that death has on the rest of the characters. You have to make it real. With Kristoff, it took some narration, the abrupt ending to Chapter 20, and the military burial in Chapter 21, as well as the reactions of Sepp and Roma. In the case of other characters, like Kanbei, it was more about the politics. What were the political results of his death? Since he wasn't a main character, and not even a minor character, how was I going to ensure his absence was felt in the story? Those were the questions I had to answer. Q. What were your favorite elements of writing A War Apart? A. Narrating Sammy, definitely. She's strong, brave, compelling, and interesting. She's got her strengths and her flaws. Her actions and lines just flowed. Writing the development of Kristoff was equally entertaining. He's a hurt soul by the end, and I got to see firsthand how he got there. How he lived, how he died. I don't enjoy seeing people die, of course, but the development is the compelling part. Sammy might have been fun, but she's a pre-existing character. Kristoff was entirely my own creation. And the big reveals are just as fun for authors to write them as they are for fans to read them, by the way. Q. So, in general fiction terms, what are your biggest influences and favorite authors? A. Joe Abercrombie. He is my number one. Before him I didn't read fantasy, and now I'm hooked. His epic trilogy, The First Law, opened me up to black and grey morality. That and he does a phenomenal job of creating interesting characters. The people he molds are incredibly real and deep. Seriously, as long as you don't mind that nearly every one of his characters is, in some way or another, an asshole, read Abercrombie. Stephen Baxter is a well-known author in the science fiction community. He writes hard sci-fi, which is about the only sci-fi I read. Great author, wonderful stories that deal with the big issues of humanity and realism out the ear. If you read or watch sci-fi and chafe every time someone survives a black hole or travels through time, read Baxter. Beyond them, I've read a wide variety of authors. Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising and Harold Coyle's Team Yankee are both stories about a hypothetical, conventional Third World War between NATO and the USSR. Much of the behavior and functioning of certain weapons and military organizations in A War Apart comes from their books. The video game World in Conflict is based around that same idea of NATO versus Warsaw minus ICBMs, and it provided me with much inspiration. Great game, pick it up if you like strategy. It's not really related, but I've started on Terry Pratchett's Discworld stuff. Also great. Hilarious too. Q. Now that you're done, what are your plans for the future? Am I going to keep writing? Yes. I'm hooked. I currently have ideas and a framework for a fantasy story. Dark, gritty fantasy, like that guy Abercrombie I was talking about. There's some written, but it's just primer stuff. My goal for that story? Follow in Joe Abercrombie's footsteps and bloodily subvert every fantasy trope I can get my hands on. My fiction press tag is CEE2027. Check me out. I have an old short story posted, so feel free to read it. Exactly when I begin the new fantasy story is up in the air. Don't hold your breath, but don't give up either. It will happen. And this coming semester is a lot freer than the last, so it could be sooner than you think. It could be sooner than I think. Q. What about In War's world? Are you going to come back to it? I'll be honest, I haven't decided. A War Apart is a self-contained story, and there are no loose ends to be tied up. If you think there are, go ahead and imply. The answers are not supposed to be elusive. If I did come back, it would be to the new, post-DS world I have created, barring the release of a new War's World game. But, that being said, it could happen. I do have ideas floating around, and some even on paper. If I do another Advance Wars piece, it will definitely be from a different country's point of view, with Nintendo characters and new ones alike. I would also probably take a different route and avoid the straight-up combat, certainly of the armored sort. Maybe political intrigue, maybe Air Force, maybe Navy, who can say? Just remember what Nell said, there will be civil war in Yellow Comet. Thus ends A War Apart. This is a random audiobook appeared, signing off.